Let's talk about how to figure out the why behind a student's behavior. Figuring out the why is essentially figuring out the function or what is maintaining or keeping that behavior alive. So, the objective of this slideshow is to understand the common functions or kind of the why behind a student's behavior and what is maintaining, what is keeping that behavior alive for that student. So first, what we want to do is determine the behavior's first, what we want to do in determining the behavior's function is to identify and define the problem behavior. You want to make sure you're using very objective and objective language to operationally define that behavior. So instead of saying something like he had a fit, say exactly what happened. He crumpled up his paper and threw it on the ground. Eventually, when a whole team has similar language of what they're looking at, you can use the word refusal, but we want to start by really defining it clearly so others can see what are we looking for? What type of behavior are we looking for? Then you want to collect data. A lot of times in a full functional behavior assessment, this comes in the form of interviews of the teacher, the family and caregivers, the student sometimes, and then you want to collect informational data on the behavior using a ABC type of format. And then you can go in after you've collected quite a bit of data and figure out and identify what the function is or the why behind the behavior. So before we start, let's just review what the three-term contingency is. So you want to look at data in terms of the antecedent or the stimulus or environmental events that happen right before the behavior, which is measurable and observable response, and then the consequence is what happens right afterwards. So it's not a judgment statement of like the consequence, as a lot of people think of, is just literally what happened right after the behavior, a stimulus or environmental event that happened right after. So when you take ABC data, this comes from a textbook on functional behavior assessment. You want to record the student's name, the setting, the observer, so that would be me, and then the time and date. And then here's the A, B, and C. So antecedent and setting as events. Sometimes people think of a four-term contingency with a setting events like or distal setting events that you want to mention here, just in case the student is constantly coming to school hungry, for example, and you want to record that because if every morning they come and then they start having behavior that is challenging, then we can address some of those distal setting events. But you want to think about what happens first in the behavior and then the consequence. Once you've done that, then we want to talk about how almost all behavior occurs in order to either obtain or avoid something. So they're either trying to obtain attention or avoid attention. They're trying to obtain or avoid tangible items or an activity, or they're trying to obtain or avoid sensory conditions. It really boils down to that. And as we know, behavior is language. Students are trying to tell us something with their behavior. So, this is a way for us to really clearly define the function or the why behind the behavior. For those of you who are visual, I like this matrix here because once you start taking your ABC data, you can plug it into this chart and you can really clearly see, okay, it looks like they are trying to obtain attention with all of their behavior, and you can clearly see things kind of show up in different parts. So are they obtaining or avoiding attention, obtaining or avoiding tangible or activities, obtaining or avoiding sensory conditions? And you can just write it here in narrative form. So knowing the function of the behavior, it does lead to what's called a behavior intervention plan. So this is a much more comprehensive, full functional behavior assessment is much more comprehensive where you are testing out that theory and so forth. But this is the beginning of understanding how we find functions, because once we do know the function of the behavior, we can work on finding replacement behaviors that serve that same function in hopefully a more adaptive and socially appropriate way than the previous behavior was doing. We want to make sure that the replacement behavior is something possibly easier to do, so not harder for the student to do the same, to meet the same needs. So for example, if a student is trying to obtain attention in a classroom and the behavior before was yelling out, we want to make sure they have new tools that we go in and teach for them to be able to obtain that same attention from a teacher. And just as a reminder, behavior, just like any other subject in school, is something we have to teach. It's not something that we can expect students to come in with already, but we have to go in and teach it just like math and English language arts. Thank you so much for watching, and I appreciate your efforts in being an inclusive educator and thinking about how we can support all of our students in the classroom. Here's a couple sources. So I did go into the IRIS modules and get that really cool matrix. Check that out. They have a really good FBA module there.